What if the truth about our ancient past isn't missing, but buried beneath layers of doubt, silence, and disbelief? Across 5 continents, mysterious artifacts have surfaced, each defying mainstream explanations. A Sumerian bull found in Bolivia. Egyptian glyphs carved into Australian sandstone. A UFO message plate uncovered on English Moors. Tablets older than Mesopotamia in Romanian soil. And a 3D map of the Earth dated to before the age of dinosaurs. These aren't myths, they're real objects, catalogued, photographed, and in some cases, quietly locked away. Are we missing the bigger picture? Are these relics proof that ancient humans traveled farther, remembered longer? Or were guided by something otherworldly? Let's journey into the impossible, and see what survives the scrutiny. In the quiet highlands near Lake Titicaca, Bolivia, one of the most remote regions in South America, an unassuming artifact was discovered that could potentially rewrite everything we know about ancient global contact. Known today as the Fuente Magna bowl, it is a large ceremonial stone vessel, roughly the size of a wash basin, carved with intricate inscriptions and motifs. What makes it extraordinary is not just its age or artistry, but the script etched inside. According to several independent researchers, the bowl appears to bear unmistakable signs of Sumerian cuneiform and even Proto-Sumerian writing. Let that sink in, an artifact that belongs to the cultural domain of Mesopotamia, widely accepted as the cradle of civilization, was found in a pre-Columbian archaeological context. Over 7,000 miles away from where it should be. To understand the gravity of this claim, one must revisit the fundamental assumptions of mainstream archaeology. According to prevailing theories, there was no transoceanic contact between the civilizations of the Old World, like Mesopotamia, and those of the New World, such as the Andean cultures of South America, before the time of Columbus. The idea that ancient Sumerians, or anyone from the ancient Near East, could have traveled across the Atlantic and left inscriptions in Bolivia is not just controversial. It's considered heretical in academic circles. But the Fuente Magna bowl stubbornly refuses to disappear from conversation. The bowl was allegedly discovered in the 1950s or 60s on a private estate near Tiahuanaco, an ancient site itself steeped in mystery. The local farmers who uncovered it didn't initially recognize its importance. For years, it was used as a livestock trough, a curious relic of uncertain origin. It wasn't until the 1990s that Bolivian archaeologist Bernardo Biados and researcher Freddy Arce brought the bowl to the attention of the wider world. They noted the dual scripts carved into its inner surface. One side appeared to bear writing reminiscent of the ancient Pucara or Tiwanaku styles, while the other, most shockingly, resembled Mesopotamian cuneiform. It's easy to understand why such a claim raised eyebrows. The notion of a Sumerian artifact sitting in a field in Bolivia sounded absurd to academics trained in diffusionist models of civilization. In their view, cultures evolved in isolation, or at most spread regionally through conquest and trade. The transoceanic diffusion of writing systems thousands of years ago. That was fringe territory, something one might expect to hear from conspiracy theorists, not credentialed archaeologists. But the mystery deepens. Photographs of the bowl made their way to Dr. Clyde Winters, a linguist who had long studied ancient scripts and their relationships across early civilizations. He asserted that the writing on the Fuente Magna bowl was indeed Proto-Sumerian and that it could be translated with known cuneiform lexicons. According to his interpretations, the bowl may have been used for religious or ritual purposes, possibly involving a fertility goddess. The inscriptions referred to offerings, divine rites, and a form of ceremonial dedication that mirrored similar practices in ancient Mesopotamia. Consider this: Egyptian mummies have been found with traces of nicotine and cocaine in their systems, substances native to the Americas. Roman coins have surfaced in North American archaeological sites. Polynesian chickens were in South America before European contact. And now, perhaps, we have cuneiform in Bolivia. For the viewer aged 65 and older, those who grew up in the post-war decades, when science and archaeology seem to offer clean answers and clear lines of human progress, this may be both fascinating and unsettling. You were taught history as a timeline, linear and logical. From the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia to the empires of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and eventually to modernity, everything fit neatly into its box. But what if it doesn't? What if the map of the ancient world had more lines than we've ever dared imagine? What if cultures met, traded, and blended long before our textbooks say they could? The Fuente Magna bowl stands as a quiet but firm challenge to the established timeline. And the establishment knows it. This is likely why mainstream institutions have treated the bowl with silence rather than scrutiny. To date, there has been no comprehensive peer-reviewed study of the bowl conducted by Western institutions. It is not displayed in a major museum. Its provenance is often called into question, with skeptics claiming it may be a modern hoax. And yet, no one has conclusively proven it to be fraudulent. There are no tool marks that would suggest modern carving instruments. The bowl's weathering is consistent with an ancient artifact exposed to centuries of environmental stress. And the inscriptions? If they are a hoax, they are the work of a forger with an extraordinary grasp of a dead language, one not taught outside a narrow circle of scholars. That alone should raise eyebrows. Skeptics argue that the Fuente Magna bowl is simply a coincidence, a case of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. They say the lines are random, the symbols accidental, and that to draw a connection to Sumer is wishful thinking at best. But if it were that simple, the debate would have ended long ago. Instead, it persists. Because while mainstream archaeologists dismiss the bowl as too good to be true, others point out that dismissing without investigating is not science, it's dogma. If we are truly committed to understanding our past, shouldn't we examine all evidence, however inconvenient it might be? And here lies the heart of the mystery. The Fuente Magna bowl doesn't just challenge one theory, it undermines an entire worldview. It suggests that the oceans were highways, not barriers. That civilizations may have risen and fallen before the ones we know. That contact between continents was not the exception, but perhaps the norm. It's a sobering thought. Because if Sumerians, or their cultural descendants, reached South America, then the story of humanity is more entangled, more dynamic, and more mysterious than we've been led to believe. And if that story has been hidden, or ignored, what else lies in the shadows of history, waiting to be rediscovered? The debate surrounding the Fuente Magna bowl is not just about whether the object is real, it's about what it implies. If authentic, it could potentially rewrite thousands of years of accepted history. A single bowl carved with characters never supposed to be in South America poses a far deeper question: who wrote it, and how did they get here? Let's go back to the moment of discovery. The story traces to the 1950s, when a Bolivian farmer reportedly unearthed the bowl on private land near Lake Titicaca. But as with so many controversial artifacts, official documentation is scarce. The first public mention didn't arrive until decades later, when Bolivian archaeologist Bernardo Biados and epigrapher Dr. Clyde Winters began examining photographs of the artifact. Winters made the startling claim that the inscriptions resembled Proto-Sumerian and even Libico-Berber script, a hybrid that, if true, would point to contact between the Old World and the New World millennia before Columbus. He translated the bowl's inscriptions as a dedication to a Mesopotamian goddess, Nia or Ninhursag, who was worshipped as the mother of the gods in ancient Sumer. A ritual object? A votive offering? The implications were staggering. But critics were quick to pounce. Several mainstream archaeologists dismissed the claim outright, calling the inscription pseudo-cuneiform, random scratches misinterpreted by hopeful fringe theorists. Others argued that the supposed writing didn't follow known Sumerian syntax, or that the bowl's carving technique didn't match Mesopotamian stonework. Yet, curiously, no one offered a solid alternative. If it wasn't Sumerian, then what was it? Even more puzzling, why was such a complex artifact found at all in the Andes, and why did its form and symbolism mirror ceremonial vessels from Uruk or Kish? There's another layer to consider: Lake Titicaca itself. At 12,500 feet above sea level, it's the highest navigable lake in the world. And according to Andean mythology, it is the place where the world began. The Inca believed their creator god, Viracocha, rose from the depths of this lake and shaped humanity. He was described as a bearded, robed figure, oddly resembling Mesopotamian or even Mediterranean depictions of deities. So here's where the parallels start to blur lines between archaeology and mythology. Could there be a reason so many ancient origin myths, from Sumer to the Andes to Polynesia, feature seaborne gods arriving in ships of light? Could the Fuente Magna bowl be physical evidence of these stories being more than symbolic? Skeptics say it's impossible. The distance between Mesopotamia and Bolivia is over 7,000 miles, including an ocean. No Sumerian ship could have made that voyage, they argue. But is that based on fact, or assumption? Let's examine a growing field of inquiry: ancient transoceanic contact. Evidence of possible pre-Columbian contact across oceans has been building for decades. Egyptian cocaine, mummies, Polynesian chickens in South America, and Olmec statues with African facial features, these are just a few of the anomalies that hint at a global ancient world more connected than we admit. In the case of the Fuente Magna bowl, the very location supports the possibility of outside influence. Tiwanaku, a mysterious archaeological site just 15 kilometers from the lake, features stonework with megalithic precision that rivals the pyramids of Egypt. Some scholars, including Arthur Poznansky, believe Tiwanaku predated the Inca by thousands of years, possibly as early as 15,000 BCE, a timeframe that would align with the tail end of the last Ice Age. If true, could an even older culture, perhaps predating Sumer itself, have traveled the world, leaving behind relics like the Fuente Magna bowl? Let's entertain one of the more radical theories, that of a seafaring pre-flood civilization. In this scenario, the Sumerians were not the originators of knowledge, but the inheritors, and they recorded their gods, the Anunnaki, as beings who descended from the heavens after the deluge. What if these beings were part of a technologically advanced group that moved between continents, not with sailboats, but with some now-lost method of propulsion? This ties into a controversial idea proposed by ancient astronaut theorists, that these gods were not divine, but rather advanced visitors who seeded civilization in different parts of the world. The Fuente Magna bowl, then, becomes not just a piece of pottery, but a cultural fossil, a breadcrumb in a trail scattered across oceans and millennia. Still, we must ground ourselves. There are challenges to validating the bowl. It was never excavated professionally. No carbon dating has been publicly verified. The site where it was found has not yielded comparable artifacts. And Bolivia's own archaeological community has remained largely silent on the matter, possibly to avoid controversy, or worse, to avoid drawing attention to what lies beneath Andean soil. This silence is mirrored globally. Museums often hold anomalous artifacts in basement vaults, rarely displayed or discussed. Could this be due to lack of provenance? Or fear of what rewriting history would entail? The Smithsonian Institution has long faced accusations of covering up discoveries that challenge orthodox timelines. Whistleblowers claim entire skeletons, maps, and inscriptions have disappeared after discovery. While these claims are hard to prove, they linger, like the shadow of something just beyond the edge of academic vision. So we return to the bull. Is it a fake, a clever forgery made to stoke conspiracy? Possibly. But if so, why does no one take credit for it? Why? Hasn't it been definitively disproved, chemically dated, or publicly debunked? Instead, it languishes in a museum in La Paz, barely acknowledged. Or perhaps that's exactly the point. Because whether real or not, the Fuente Magna bull forces us to ask questions mainstream archaeology has tried to settle long ago. Questions about where civilization began, and whether it began more than once. What if ancient people knew things we are only just rediscovering? What if global trade, cultural exchange, and even advanced travel existed long before recorded history? What if the Sumerian script on a Bolivian bowl isn't an error or an anomaly, but a reminder? A reminder that history is not fixed. It is written by the survivors, and edited by those who stand to gain. And in a dusty corner of a museum, a single carved bowl may be trying to tell us the truth. In the still chill of late November 1957, 3 men set out for a walk across Silpho Moor, a quiet stretch of land near the town of Scarborough, England. What they found, or claimed to have found, would ignite one of the strangest and most enduring UFO mysteries in British history. Their discovery was a small metallic disc, roughly 16 inches in diameter and weighing close to 20 pounds. Burnt on one edge and covered in bizarre engravings, the object looked like something torn from the pages of science fiction. But this wasn't fiction, not yet. The men, led by businessman Fred Taylor, said they discovered the disc embedded in the earth near a bracken-covered hillside. Taylor's companions, Anthony Parker and Philip Longbottom, initially thought it was debris from a military exercise or perhaps even an experimental aircraft. But as they examined the disc more closely, its unusual features began to reveal themselves. It wasn't just the scorched metal or the perfectly symmetrical construction that raised eyebrows, it was the hieroglyph-like etchings carved across its surface. Symbols that, according to some, resembled a mix of ancient runes, stylized cuneiform, and even Mayan-like glyphs. When the disc was eventually opened, its mystery deepened further. Inside were tightly rolled sheets of copper, bearing an even more peculiar sight, hundreds of thin metal foil sheets, each inscribed with tiny text, more of the mysterious glyphs, laid out in spiraling patterns. It wasn't long before someone declared the object to be a message from the stars. A local journalist dubbed it Britain's Roswell, comparing the disc to the alleged UFO crash in Roswell, New Mexico, just a decade earlier. Word of the Silpho disc spread quickly, drawing curious onlookers, journalists, skeptics, and believers. But before proper scientific analysis could be performed, the disc mysteriously vanished. And so began a mystery that would stretch over 6 decades. In the years that followed, bits and pieces of the disc's contents were recovered, lost again, and re-examined. The message supposedly contained within the foil was translated, at least partially, by Philip Longbottom himself, who believed the writing warned of humanity's self-destruction. The message, allegedly from an extraterrestrial entity named Ullo, was a plea for peace, cautioning mankind against nuclear war and environmental ruin. A message eerily reflective of the anxieties of the Cold War era. Skeptics, however, were quick to point fingers. Many claimed that the whole affair was an elaborate hoax engineered by Longbottom or one of his associates. They pointed to inconsistencies in the story, changing details about where the disc was found, the sudden disappearance of the full artifact, and the almost too perfect Cold War message encoded within. Some critics labeled the glyphs meaningless scribbles, while others noted the unscientific methods of the artifact's examination. Even Scarborough's local press distanced itself from the story after the initial frenzy died down. Yet, despite the cloud of doubt, interest in the Silpho disc never entirely faded. In fact, decades later, it would be revived by science. In 2018, researchers at the Science Museum in London were shocked to discover parts of the Silpho disc hidden away in their archives. Several metal fragments and 3 small copper sheets with writing were tucked inside a cigarette tin, long forgotten. Where had they come from? Who deposited them? Why were they never properly studied? With renewed interest, metallurgical experts at the University of Manchester conducted an analysis on the disc fragments. Their findings were unexpected. The metal appeared to be unusually pure, possibly smelted using advanced techniques for the 1950s. There were no obvious tool marks, welds, or rivets. More curious still, the metal was highly resistant to corrosion, even after decades in storage. While not definitive proof of extraterrestrial origin, these properties did raise legitimate scientific questions. And then there was the writing. Language experts and cryptographers have attempted to decode the strange script for years, with varying degrees of speculation. Some believe the glyphs follow a logical pattern, possibly based on an unknown substitution cipher. Others assert the text is gibberish, meant to appear alien, but ultimately meaningless. Interestingly, the message's tone, if Longbottom's translation is to be trusted, echoes similar warnings reported by contactees in other parts of the world during the 1950s and 60s. Could this be part of a pattern? Or was it inspired by existing UFO lore? Conspiracy theorists have suggested the Silpho disc was quietly confiscated by British intelligence. According to this theory, the government deemed the artifact too controversial for public discussion and hid it away to avoid another Roswell-style media explosion. The sudden disappearance of the full disc from public view certainly adds weight to this idea. Though officially dismissed as a hoax, there has never been a formal government investigation or detailed report released to the public. Others propose that the disc could have been part of a psychological experiment, perhaps even a Cold War era social test designed to gauge public reaction to alien contact. Similar theories surround the Roswell incident and other mid-century UFO sightings. In this interpretation, the Silpho disc wasn't from another planet, it was from another department. A Black Ops project with a mission not to inform, but to manipulate. Yet another possibility points toward artistic expression gone too far. Perhaps the disc was a carefully constructed piece of performance art, planted as a form of proto-ARG, alternate reality game, decades before the term existed. If so, the artist's identity remains unknown, and the purpose, equally mysterious. And still, the question remains, why does the Silpho disc continue to haunt UFO lore? Why does it resist resolution? Perhaps it's because it falls into that tantalizing space between the impossible and the merely improbable. A physical object, found by credible individuals, with real materials and real inscriptions, yet surrounded by contradictions and unanswered questions. As the decades passed, the Silpho disc quietly disappeared from public awareness, until it was rediscovered in the most unlikely of places. In 2018, more than 60 years after the disc first stirred headlines, fragments of the artifact turned up inside the Science Museum Group's storage archives in London. Tucked away in a tin cigarette box, the remnants were labeled simply and anonymously. There was no provenance paperwork, no note of who submitted the pieces, and, most intriguingly, no formal analysis on record. Among the rediscovered materials were 3 inscribed copper foil sheets and several metallic fragments that matched descriptions of the original disc. Experts quickly confirmed the items as consistent with the 1957 reports. And just like that, the mystery returned, less as a dusty legend, and more as a physical puzzle begging to be re-examined with modern tools. Curators and scientists from the Science Museum, along with metallurgists from the University of Manchester, began testing the materials. Their results echoed the ambiguity of the entire case. The copper sheets were indeed old, but not aged enough to be definitively prehistoric or alien. The metal's purity and resilience to corrosion were notable, unusual for items of unknown manufacture, but not entirely unexplainable. No manufacturing stamps or tool markings were present. Nothing screamed alien, but nothing ruled it out either. The glyphs on the copper strips were again analyzed. Some linguists described them as pseudotext, carefully rendered markings made to look like language without conveying any coherent message. But others noted that the glyphs were consistent across multiple foil strips, suggesting intention rather than random design. And then there was the translation. Back in the 1960s, Philip Longbottom had claimed to translate the message from the foil sheets. According to him, the disc bore a warning from an extraterrestrial named Ullo, who had come to Earth with a plea for peace and enlightenment. The message contained cryptic phrases such as, "You will improve or disappear," and "We shall not come again until the Earth is ready." These phrases resonated deeply with the post-World War II generation, which was still grappling with the specter of nuclear annihilation and the dawn of the space race. Skeptics scoffed, suggesting that Longbottom simply fabricated the translation to suit the growing appetite for UFO stories. But others pointed out that this was a recurring theme in contactee stories from the same era, peaceful beings from the stars warning humanity of self-destruction. The consistency of the narrative raised a provocative question: were these messages independently invented by imaginative storytellers, or were they all pointing to a real, shared source? In the Cold War atmosphere of 1957, Britain was a nation in flux. The Suez Crisis had recently humbled the empire. Nuclear anxiety ran high. The USSR had just launched Sputnik, igniting a race not just for space, but for ideological superiority. The public's imagination was primed for intrusion, from space, from government, from within. And in that fertile soil, the Silpho disk landed with eerie precision. Indeed, the idea that the disk could be part of a psychological operation has not been fully dismissed. Some believe it may have been planted intentionally, by intelligence agencies testing public reaction to extraterrestrial themes, or by scientists gauging the boundary between belief and skepticism. It's worth noting that the British Ministry of Defense did, in later decades, admit to running secret programs investigating UFOs, not necessarily to find aliens, but to monitor the psychological and military implications of mass sightings. Then there's the museum angle, a quieter but no less telling aspect of the mystery. Why did such an unusual artifact, with significant local press and national interest, disappear into storage for so long without formal investigation? Was it misfiled and forgotten? Or was someone, somewhere, deliberately hiding it away? It wouldn't be the first time a strange artifact ended up lost in a museum basement. History is full of miscategorized relics, anomalous bones labeled as animal, bizarre tools labeled as ritual objects, and old maps suggesting knowledge we weren't supposed to have. If the Silpho disk had truly been a hoax, why not leave it in public view as a curiosity? Why stash it away, unexamined, for 60 years? Adding another layer to the puzzle are the eyewitnesses. Over the years, interviews with those originally involved produced an ever-evolving story. One version says the disc was found half buried in bracken, another says it was discovered with scorch marks around it, as if it had crash-landed. One man claimed to have hidden it in a garage. Another insisted the government took it away. The contradictions raise red flags, but also reflect a phenomenon familiar in UFO research. When multiple people experience something strange, memories often shift under pressure. And the passage of time only muddles them further. Despite, or perhaps because of, these contradictions, the Silpho disc remains one of the UK's most enduring UFO legends. It's been featured in documentaries, debated in forums, and even inspired local folklore. A trail sign near Silpho More today includes a small marker mentioning the 1957 space disk, as if acknowledging both the absurdity and the gravity of the event. Even now, UFO researchers point to the Silpho case as a classic example of soft disclosure, not a definitive event that proves alien contact, but a lingering breadcrumb that suggests something deeper beneath the surface of official history. Whether it was a hoax, a psychological test, an artifact from beyond our world, or simply an unsolved oddity, the Silpho disc invites us to ask a broader question. Why do some mysteries endure, even in the absence of proof? Perhaps it's because they touch on something primal, the feeling that we are being watched, warned, or prepared. Perhaps it's because the universe still holds secrets, and stories like this remind us not to become too comfortable in what we think we know. Or perhaps, as some believe, the disc was a message, not meant to be understood when it was found, but waiting for the right moment in history to be fully decoded. The disc remains in pieces, its full contents never publicly revealed, its origin story mired in confusion. But like Roswell, Rendlesham, and Kecksburg, the Silpho case continues to echo, not as a solved mystery, but as a challenge to look again, to dig deeper, to ask, what lies hidden in our moors, our memories, and our museums? Because sometimes, the truth isn't buried. It's shelved. In 1961, during an archaeological dig in the village of Tărtăria, nestled in central Romania's Transylvanian region, a discovery was made that would ripple through the world of archaeology and prehistory. At first glance, the excavation site seemed typical: pottery shards, skeletal remains, and other Neolithic-era artifacts were unearthed. But 3 small clay tablets, no more than a few inches in diameter, would ignite a controversy still unresolved over half a century later. These tablets, now referred to as the Tărtăria Tablets, were unlike anything else found in the region. What stunned archaeologists wasn't just their age, but the marks pressed into their surfaces. Carefully etched lines formed shapes, symbols, and patterns eerily reminiscent of cuneiform writing, specifically, the kind associated with ancient Sumeria in Mesopotamia. The resemblance was not coincidental, the symbols bore a striking similarity to proto-cuneiform signs dated to nearly 1,000 years later. But here was the problem: the Tărtăria tablets were older. Much older. Carbon dating of associated materials placed the tablets at around 5,300 BCE, nearly 1,000 years before the earliest known Sumerian writing from Uruk. That timeline threatened to unravel one of the foundational assumptions of ancient history, that writing began in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, around 3,200 BCE. If these tablets truly bore written language, and if they truly were that old, then Romania, not Iraq, might hold the title for the birthplace of writing. That claim has, understandably, sparked fierce debate. The tablets themselves are simple in construction. 2 are rectangular, and 1 is round. All 3 are inscribed with a variety of symbols, lines, crosses, trees, spirals, and markings that resemble both numerals and abstract ideograms. 1 tablet is pierced with holes, perhaps indicating it was worn as an amulet or badge of status. The Impressions are shallow but deliberate, clearly not accidental scratches, and positioned with intent. Professor Nikolai Vlasa, who led the 1961 excavation, was the first to propose that the tablets contained a form of symbolic communication. He compared them to early Sumerian writing and concluded they could represent a local, prehistoric script from what would later be called the Vinca culture. Vlasa's conclusion was bold, and it set off waves of speculation. The Vinca culture, which spanned modern-day Serbia, Romania, and parts of Bulgaria and Hungary between 5700 and 4500 BCE, was already considered highly advanced for its time. Their settlements were large, their ceramics exquisite, and their art full of anthropomorphic figurines with almond-shaped eyes, eerily reminiscent of later depictions of gods or, as fringe theorists suggest, extraterrestrial visitors. But written language? That was a leap few scholars were ready to take. Traditional archaeologists pushed back. They argued the symbols on the Tărtăria Tablets might not constitute writing per se, but proto-writing, symbols representing concepts or rituals rather than phonetic sounds or structured language. The distinction matters. Writing implies a sophisticated system of grammar and semantics, proto-writing is more symbolic or mnemonic, like tally marks or religious icons. And yet, the symbols on the Tărtăria Tablets seem to go beyond the typical abstract patterns seen in Neolithic art. They repeat, align, and even form sequences, hallmarks of communicative intent. Some researchers, particularly outside the mainstream academic establishment, took the claim further. They proposed that the Tărtăria Tablets were evidence of a lost civilization predating Mesopotamia, a mother culture that seeded language across Eurasia. They cited the similarity between the Vinca symbols and Sumerian pictographs as possible proof of cultural diffusion or ancient contact. How, they asked, could two geographically distant civilizations develop such similar writing systems independently? Others proposed more radical theories, that the Tărtăria Tablets pointed to a forgotten global civilization that flourished before the last ice age, or that the Vinca people were in direct contact with early Mesopotamians through a trade or migration route long lost to history. Some even suggested extraterrestrial influence, citing the abstract otherworldly appearance of Vinca figurines and the sudden, unexplained rise in symbolic complexity. Mainstream archaeologists countered with a simpler explanation: coincidence. Symbols like crosses, lines, spirals, and trees are common across early human cultures. They may reflect shared cognitive structures, not shared cultural contact. And while the carbon dating of surrounding bones and materials placed the tablets at 5300 BCE, the tablets themselves were not directly dated. Since they were fired clay, not organic matter, they couldn't be carbon dated directly. This left room for debate: could the tablets have been introduced into the grave later, by later intruders, or as part of a ritual? There's also the matter of the burial context. The tablets were found in a grave alongside the burned bones of a woman, possibly a shaman or priestess. Some researchers see this as evidence of the tablets' ritual function. They weren't documents, but sacred items. This would support the proto-writing hypothesis, suggesting the symbols represented religious concepts, deities, or cosmological cycles rather than linguistic text. But the burial context could also imply something deeper: a society that not only revered symbols but embedded them in their death rituals, perhaps even recording the passage of the soul, the names of ancestors, or sacred knowledge. And if that's the case, does it not still qualify as writing, even if we don't yet understand the language? As more Vinca-era sites are discovered across Eastern Europe, the case for symbolic sophistication continues to grow. Hundreds of other Vinca artifacts, including pottery, figurines, and altars, have been found with similar markings. The consistency of these symbols across space and time suggests a coherent system, not random decoration. Yet despite decades of study, no one has managed to definitively decode the Vinca script, or even confirm it is a script at all. This brings us to the crux of the mystery, the boundary between art and language, between symbols and syntax. The Tărtăria Tablets sit right on that threshold. If they are symbolic art, they're impressive. If they're writing, they are revolutionary. And then there is the question of erasure. Why, if the Vinca had developed such a sophisticated symbolic system, did it vanish? Why is there no historical continuity between Vinca symbols and later European scripts? Was there a cultural reset? A collapse? Or were their intellectual achievements absorbed by other, rising civilizations, perhaps? Even by those who would later settle in Mesopotamia? These are the questions that make the Tărtăria Tablets so compelling. They represent a genuine archaeological enigma, material artifacts that exist, can be touched, analyzed, photographed, and yet remain opaque. For decades, the Tărtăria Tablets remained relatively obscure, stored in the National Museum of Transylvania. History in Cluj-Napoca, away from the spotlight granted to more accepted artifacts of world-changing significance. Whether this was due to academic caution, Cold War politics, or genuine skepticism remains debated. But one thing is certain, the full potential of what these tablets might represent has never been publicly explored on a mainstream scale. Some believe this neglect is accidental. Others call it deliberate. The 1960s, when the tablets were discovered, were a time of heightened political tension. Romania, under communist rule, had little access to Western academia. Western archaeologists and epigraphers had limited opportunities to study the tablets firsthand, and few translations or photographs were shared beyond Eastern Bloc countries. Some suggest that this geopolitical divide delayed the global academic community from fully grappling with their implications. Even when images were eventually shared, the context of the tablets' discovery remained murky, and few were willing to base a rewriting of history on 3 untranslatable clay discs. But those who took interest, especially independent researchers, have been unrelenting. One of the most persistent advocates for the significance of the Tărtăria Tablets was Maria Gimbutas, the Lithuanian-American archaeologist and anthropologist who advanced the theory of Old Europe, a peaceful pre-Indo-European civilization that flourished in the Balkans and beyond. Gimbutas saw the Vinca symbols, including those on the Tărtăria Tablets, not as isolated decorative motifs, but as a coherent symbolic system. She even compared them to sacred signs, lunar cycles, female deities, agricultural totems, and proposed they represented a kind of matristic language, a female-centric spiritual and social lexicon lost to time. Critics of Gimbutas dismissed this as romantic speculation. But to her credit, she gathered an immense catalogue of recurring signs from Neolithic Europe, many of which mirror the symbols found on the tablets. If this were proto-writing, then the Vinca civilization may have had the capacity for symbolic abstraction long before the Sumerians etched their first cuneiform signs into clay. But if that's true, what happened to this language? Here we must confront an unsettling possibility, that history is not just shaped by what is found, but by what is allowed to be seen. The Vinca script, including the Tărtăria Tablets, is conspicuously absent from most Western educational materials. While cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs are taught as foundational writing systems, the possibility of a European proto-script is barely acknowledged. Some argue that this is due to lack of conclusive translation, an understandable position. Others suggest that the omission is due to the weight it would place on Western historical narratives. If language began in Eastern Europe rather than the Near East, it would upend more than just geography. It would challenge the chronology of civilizational progress itself. Let's consider a troubling hypothetical. What if these symbols have already been partially deciphered, but such findings were suppressed because of the implications? There are accounts, often dismissed as fringe, that claim a number of researchers found correlations between the Tărtăria symbols and both linear A, used by the Minoans, and early Sumerian pictographs. Some even argue that certain ideograms match early Chinese glyphs. If true, this would imply a global symbolic lexicon that predates known cultural contact, something only possible if a now forgotten mother culture once disseminated language or symbols across continents. And the story gets stranger. In recent years, alternative researchers have revisited the Tărtăria tablets using digital imaging, symbol matching algorithms, and linguistic software. While no formal translation has emerged, some interesting hypotheses have surfaced. For example, one researcher proposed that the symbols on one tablet appear to follow a ritual sequence, a solar emblem, followed by a tri-line symbol, possibly representing harvest or rain, followed by a spiral, commonly linked with time or rebirth. Could it be a calendar? A liturgical prayer? A record of celestial events? But here's where academic orthodoxy digs in its heels. The burden of proof is high, perhaps impossibly so. Without a bilingual key like the Rosetta Stone, it's nearly impossible to verify if a translation is correct. Any attempt to read the tablets risks accusations of pseudoscience. And yet, we allow assumptions about other ancient scripts without full translation. Linear A remains undeciphered, but is accepted as writing. Rongorongo from Easter Island is likewise a mystery, but studied as a script. Why not the Vinca system? Could it be because it challenges the primacy of Mesopotamia? Some theorists go even further, suggesting there was a deliberate campaign, starting in the mid-20th century, to downplay or erase evidence of advanced pre-Sumerian cultures. They point to the disappearance of similar artifacts across museums, the destruction of archaeological sites during modern construction in the Balkans, and the lack of funding for further digs in the region. Conspiracy or coincidence? Let's not forget the physical signs of erasure. Many Vinca sites show evidence of sudden abandonment, widespread burning, or cultural shift. Were they invaded? Assimilated? Or, as some propose, did a great cataclysm, like the legendary deluge or Black Sea flood, wipe out these societies, leaving behind only the scattered relics like the tablets found in Tărtăria? This brings us to the philosophical heart of the matter. What is writing, really? Is it the act of recording language with grammar and syntax, as modern scholars define it? Or is it the deliberate use of symbols to encode meaning, ritual, myth, celestial observation? If we accept the latter definition, then the Tărtăria tablets deserve a place among the world's first written records. If we reject it, we must also question many other early scripts which remain untranslated. The criteria, some argue, are inconsistently applied. So we are left with 3 small clay tablets, burned, etched, and buried with reverence, whose marks may whisper the echoes of a civilization forgotten not only by time, but by our willingness to listen. What did they mean to the woman they were buried with? A sacred prayer? A record of her lineage? A key to a cosmology we've since lost? And perhaps most hauntingly, if the first language began in a land now considered marginal to world history, what else have we overlooked, dismissed, or ignored? The Tărtăria tablets remain an enigma, silent yet eloquent, simple yet profound. They ask us not just what we know about writing, but how we decide what counts as knowledge. Until we are ready to ask that question with honesty and humility, their mystery will remain intact. In the dense eucalyptus bushland of Carryong, New South Wales, hidden among twisted trees and sandstone ridges, lies one of the most controversial and enigmatic archaeological puzzles in the southern hemisphere, the Gosford Glyphs. Etched deep into the sandstone walls of two facing rock formations, these hundreds of symbols, some crude, others startlingly precise, appear to be Egyptian hieroglyphs. Not symbols inspired by Aboriginal art or colonial graffiti, but authentic-looking inscriptions echoing the scripts of ancient Egypt. They weren't discovered in a museum, a temple ruin, or even near an ancient trade route, but here, in Australia, on a bushwalking trail. The story broke publicly in the 1970s, though some claim they were first found as early as the 1920s or 1930s by a local soldier or surveyor. Visitors to the site today, tucked behind suburban Gosford, encounter a rock face covered in over 300 carved symbols, many closely resembling known glyphs from the pyramid texts and other classical Egyptian sources. There are alleged references to pharaohs, star alignments, offerings to Ra, and even a supposed tale of a mariner's journey gone wrong. To some, it's nothing more than an elaborate hoax. But to others, it's a buried link to an ancient and forgotten voyage, one that could rewrite the map of human history. Skeptics are quick to dismiss the glyphs as modern forgeries. The primary argument? The site's relatively recent visibility and lack of corroborating artifacts nearby. No pottery shards, tools, or burial remains have been found in conjunction with the carvings. For mainstream archaeologists, that's a red flag. It suggests someone, sometime in the last century, could have etched them in the style of Egyptian hieroglyphs as a prank, art project, or even to fuel a local legend. Yet, that assumption doesn't sit comfortably with everyone, especially not with those who have spent time on the ground, studying the glyphs firsthand. A number of researchers, both amateur and professional, point out several inconsistencies in the hoax theory. For starters, many of the symbols are cut deep into hard sandstone, some nearly an inch into the rock face. Achieving that kind of incision would require considerable effort, not to mention tools capable of carving through stone without leaving modern tool marks. If it was a forgery, why go to such great lengths? Then there's the matter of erosion. Several geologists and independent researchers have noted weathering patterns on the glyphs that suggest age beyond a few decades. While sandstone erodes relatively quickly, it's argued that some of the more exposed carvings show signs of moss buildup, flaking, and surface degradation consistent with older engravings. One study, conducted unofficially in the early 1990s, estimated that parts of the site could be at least several hundred years old, though this remains highly disputed and is not accepted in peer-reviewed circles. Perhaps the most compelling claim made by proponents of the glyphs' authenticity is their content, particularly the accuracy of certain hieroglyphs. Egyptologists who've examined photographs of the site have confirmed that many of the symbols are indeed accurate, even archaic. Some glyphs correspond to a style of writing found in Egypt's Old Kingdom, dating back over 4,000 years. These include specific forms of the Ankh, depictions of Ra, and verb constructs that wouldn't typically be found in popular reference materials. In fact, several of the more obscure symbols were largely unknown to the public until decades after their supposed appearance in the Gosford rock face. That raises a provocative question: if it was a modern hoax, how did the forgers know what these glyphs looked like before they were widely published? The surrounding narrative only deepens the mystery. According to interpretations of the glyphs, many offered by alternative historians or pseudoscientists, depending on who you ask, the carvings tell the tale of two Egyptian princes or envoys who sailed across the seas from Egypt, likely during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu or one of his descendants. Their ship, the story goes, was wrecked off the Australian coast. One of the men died and was buried in the area, the other, overcome with grief, carved the tail into the stone before succumbing to the same fate. This version of events might sound fantastical, but it does line up with a broader pattern of out-of-place artifacts that seem to suggest ancient maritime contact across impossible distances. Other examples include the Fuente Magna bowl in Bolivia, showing possible Sumerian script, or the Olmec heads in Central America with African features. Could the Gosford Glyphs be another piece in that scattered puzzle? Australian Aboriginal communities have their own layered relationship with the site. While the glyphs themselves are not of Aboriginal origin, there is no known Dreamtime story or oral tradition directly tied to the carvings. Many indigenous leaders recognize the land as sacred and warn against drawing attention to the glyphs. Some elders have called for the site's protection, not because they believe in an Egyptian connection, but because they view the increasing human traffic and speculation as damaging to the landscape. It's a sobering reminder that every mystery, no matter how tantalizing, plays out on someone else's land. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, mainstream archaeologists have largely ignored the glyphs, dismissing them without a full excavation or official dating attempt. That lack of investigation, ironically, fuels belief among conspiracy theorists that something is being covered up. If they're just fake, one writer asked in a local newspaper editorial, why not prove it once and for all? That's the paradox of the Gosford Glyphs. The lack of verification feeds the mystery just as much as any supposed evidence of authenticity. It's a riddle carved into the rocks of a quiet Australian hillside, one that won't be resolved easily. As the debate over the Gosford Glyphs continues to smolder, a growing community of independent researchers, enthusiasts, and skeptics alike have begun asking not just whether the glyphs are authentic, but if they are, what it would mean for the history of human exploration. Let's start with the logistics. Could the ancient Egyptians, over 4,000 years ago, have sailed to Australia? The conventional answer, of course, is no. Egyptian ships of the Old Kingdom period were certainly advanced for their time, capable of navigating the Nile and nearby Mediterranean shores. They even traded with Punt, a mysterious land thought to lie somewhere near modern Eritrea or Yemen. But crossing vast oceans? That remains, in the eyes of most historians, well beyond their reach. And yet, some fringe researchers argue otherwise. They point to the durability of Egyptian cedarwood ships, the advanced rigging systems described in tomb art, and the mysterious accounts of long sea journeys in Egyptian lore. Could an exploratory vessel, carrying envoys, traders, or perhaps exiles, have been caught in a storm and blown far off course? Adding fuel to the fire is the theory that global navigation may have existed long before the Classical Age. Advocates of this idea often cite ancient maps like the Piri Reis map, South American artifacts resembling African or Asian design motifs, or Polynesian legends that tell of tall, pale visitors long before European contact. If knowledge of the stars and oceans ran deeper in antiquity than we realize, then Egypt to Australia doesn't sound quite so impossible. Some believe there's linguistic evidence too. A few researchers claim that certain Aboriginal words and place names bear a phonetic resemblance to ancient Egyptian, though mainstream linguists flatly reject this as coincidence or cherry-picking. Still, the idea persists, particularly in alternative history circles, that ancient global contact might have seeded cultural elements across distant civilizations. But there is another, more pragmatic question that few ask: if the glyphs were faked, then who carved them, and why? No definitive culprit has been identified. One theory blames a group of World War I or II veterans who returned from service in North Africa and the Middle East, possibly carving the glyphs as a tribute or elaborate prank. Others suggest a rogue academic or teacher, hoping to create a conversation starter or field study opportunity. Yet despite decades of speculation, no first-hand confessor has stepped forward with verifiable evidence or eyewitness confirmation. Interestingly, some local Aboriginal elders recall stories passed down through generations about stone writings deep in the forest, though they never associated them with Egyptian visitors. Instead, the glyphs were seen as part of the landscape, mysterious but not necessarily foreign. That subtle detail complicates the narrative, even if Aboriginal communities didn't create the glyphs, their oral histories suggest the symbols may have been there longer than modern forgers could explain. In recent years, drone photography, 3D scans, and high-resolution imaging have been applied to the site, revealing more than just superficial carvings. Some glyphs appear to sit behind others, indicating multiple phases of carving, possibly by different hands. This is where things get murky. Does this layering suggest a hoaxer making edits over time? Or could it hint at a lost original that was later restored or added to by those who didn't fully understand it? It's important to note that there are two panels at the site, Panel 1 and Panel 2, each with a distinct style. Panel 1 features larger, deeper, more formal glyphs. Panel 2's carvings are often shallower and more inconsistent, sometimes appearing more modern. This has led some researchers to speculate that even if the site started as something authentic or ancient, later additions may have muddied the waters, making genuine research almost impossible. In 2011, an attempt was made to carbon date organic residue from inside crevices of the glyphs, but no conclusive result emerged. Without contextual artifacts or radiometric dating, mainstream institutions remain uninterested. Archaeologists from Australian universities rarely comment on the site, and heritage authorities have never launched a full investigation. Ironically, the lack of institutional interest, rather than closing the case, has only deepened public curiosity. As with many so-called forbidden sites, the Gosford Glyphs sit at the intersection of possibility and improbability. Too specific to dismiss entirely, yet too ambiguous to confirm outright, they occupy a strange archaeological limbo. And perhaps that's the most fascinating aspect of the glyphs, they make us question our assumptions. Could ancient explorers have sailed farther than we believe? Are there other sites, overgrown, eroded, or lost to time, that could tell similar stories? And more importantly, why is our academic gatekeeping so reluctant to investigate anomalies? Even if the glyphs were proven to be a hoax, isn't the real mystery why it took so long to investigate them properly? In the end, the Gosford Glyphs may never deliver a definitive answer. But they serve a crucial role, to remind us that the world is still full of mystery, and that history, despite our best efforts, rarely stays inside the lines. And so, tucked away in the brush of New South Wales, carved into the living skin of the earth, the glyphs remain silent, mysterious, unresolved, waiting, perhaps, for the right eyes to see what others cannot. In the early 1990s, a team of Russian researchers led by Professor Alexander Chuvirov stumbled upon what may be one of the most perplexing artifacts ever unearthed. Near the village of Chandar in the southern Ural Mountains, embedded within layers of sediment, they discovered a massive stone slab. Measuring over 5 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and nearly 6 inches thick, the slab was unlike anything they had ever seen before. What made it remarkable wasn't its size, composition, or even its weight, estimated at over 1 ton, but what was carved upon it. On the face of the slab was a three-dimensional relief map, painstakingly carved with astonishing precision, of a section of the Ural Mountains, complete with what appeared to be natural topography, rivers, canyons, and plateaus. But there was something else. Etched atop the terrain were what appeared to be artificial markings, lines resembling canals, dams, spillways, and roads. These elements did not match the natural erosion patterns or tectonic scars one would expect. They resembled modern civil engineering features, suggesting the map wasn't just a topographical rendering, but a blueprint. As news of the find spread, the artifact was dubbed the Dashka stone, but more provocatively by some researchers, the map of the creator. Initial geological analysis only deepened the mystery. The slab was composed of 3 distinct layers, a base of solid dolomite, a middle layer of diopside glass with an artificially smooth surface, and a thin third layer of porcelain-like calcium-rich material. These layers were not naturally formed together, and the craftsmanship suggested not only incredible knowledge of materials but tools far beyond the capabilities of known ancient civilizations. Even more controversial was its dating. Based on the fossilized remains of microscopic marine organisms embedded in the uppermost layer, and the stratigraphic context in which it was found, the stone was estimated to be between 100 and 120 million years old. That's not just ancient, it's unimaginably so. This time period predates the rise of mammals, let alone humanity. To put that into context, dinosaurs still ruled the earth, and flowering plants were just beginning to evolve. The very idea of a mapmaker existing in that era challenges the foundations of archaeology, anthropology, and earth sciences.